Okay, now that we've had a few seconds to settle in, a few moments to settle in, I'm going to start introductions. We are so lucky today to have Dr. Caroline Ebanks joining us. She is a research scientist at the U.S. Department of Education. She has been a developmental psychologist for a couple of decades now, and she brings a fantastic array of diverse experiences working with populations that are often underrepresented in our field. Dr. Ebanks is primarily a researcher, so this is a slightly different talk from those we've had in the past, where she is not in a university setting teaching, and she's also not in a clinical setting. She is really at the heart of policy making and at the heart of increasing our understanding of early childhood development, and of educational experiences and outcomes during early childhood. Dr. Ebanks received her bachelor's degree from Wellesley College. She received her Ph.D. in developmental psychology from Cornell University. Something I want to add, I've known Dr. Ebanks for 2 decades, and she is one of my favorite people on this planet. She is truly a remarkable human being and a genuinely fantastic person. So please join me in welcoming her. I am so happy to have her with us today.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here, and thank you, Dr. Alicia, for that wonderful introduction. And the sentiment is the same. I'm going to use your first name, Isabel. I consider you to be one of my dearest friends and colleagues, and it is a joy and a pleasure to know you. And thank you for the invitation to share my experience and my journey with the group this evening, with the students. And welcome to all of the students. I hope that there's some aspect of what I share that will be helpful to you. I'm going to share my screen and start up the presentation. Okay, can everyone see that? Thumbs up from someone, Isabel? Is it showing the presentation? Okay, so thank you. Great. So as I said, I'm going to provide a bit of an overview of who I am and how I got to the place where I have worked for almost 19 years now. That is the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education. Hopefully, the overview of my journey will give you a good sense of kind of where I've been. Oh, no, it's not advancing. All right. 1 second here. Okay, great. So my journey, the road less traveled. So this is really an overview of everything that I'll cover today. And I framed it as the road less traveled because in many ways, it's unique to me. So I am the first person in my family to get a PhD and the only one to follow to go into psychology, period. There are plenty of accountants and people who've gone into other fields, lots of folks who majored in economics, but I'm the odd person out in terms of that. So that's a bit unique in terms of who I am in my journey. So I'll talk a little bit about my background. I think it's always helpful to share your personal background because I think each one of us, our lived experience really informs who we are, what we do, and decisions we make along the way. And also share a bit about my educational experience. I'm going to give you guys a broad overview because there are different kind of milestones along the way that really informed how I ended up in a PhD program and where I am today in terms of my career. I'll talk about my professional experience and then my current work at the Institute of Education Sciences, and then talk a little bit about what I see as a road ahead in terms of the field of early childhood education and what keeps me going 19 years into the work that I've been doing and sort of some ideas of what I think the future holds. And then I will talk, allow for some time for discussion, and I look forward to answering your questions and to having a discussion and a dialogue with you. So the first thing you should know about me that I think is very important is that I'm an immigrant. My family immigrated from rural Jamaica to New York City when I was 9 years old, and I grew up in the Bronx, and that's a pretty significant part of my formative experience. I have some graphics here. So the large one-directional arrow kind of symbolizes that major life transition and major move from between countries and also very different contexts, moving from a rural context to as urban as one can get, New York City. And then the smaller arrow, the bidirectional arrow, just really indicates that sort of those two aspects, sort of my country of birth, as well as the country where I've lived now for most of my life, both informed who I am and how I view the world. And it's bidirectional in terms of culture, as well as sort of physical movement and other aspects of who I am and my identity. And all of that has really shaped how I approach my work, how I approach different decisions I've made at different points in my formative journey. And so I hope somehow this gives you a good sense of sort of, these were the foundations, this is where I'm coming from, and this is how I'm approaching and viewing the world. And I think my identity as an immigrant has shaped a lot of how I view the world in terms of different points in my life where I have been the other in different contexts, and how I've carried that into my education, my graduate training, as well as my current work. So a little bit about my educational experience. We're going to spend a few minutes on this slide to give you a broad overview. So I had my initial years of education in Jamaica, and it was a pretty major transition coming from a place where there was just a very different model and approach to education and learning, and moving from that context to New York City, to elementary and middle school and public schools in New York City. Those experiences, again, very important in terms of my own formative development. When I was in middle school, I was involved in this Fieldston enrichment program. It was a program where students who were considered to be promising academically, we had the opportunity to go to the Fieldston Day School in the Bronx and to go to enrichment classes during the summer and on Saturdays. And my mom, God bless her, she really had a lot of faith in kind of sending her children off. Myself and one of my brothers, there are 5 of us, that myself and one brother went to that program. As a connection to that program, I was also involved in applied to, and I'm now an alum of the A Better Chance program. And that program, which is based in New York City, but it has offices in other cities across the country, is another opportunity to really help promising students provide access to better or greater educational opportunities. So I was involved in the ABC program, and as a result of that, I spent high school. So I went from New York City public schools in the Bronx, very diverse in terms of cultures and ethnic backgrounds, immigrants, American-born folks, all people of color, to a boarding school in Andover, Massachusetts, where I was very much one of a handful of people in a completely different context in terms of income and just race and other expectations. And so that was a major part of my formative journey. And after that, my undergraduate education at Wellesley College, where I was a psychology major, and then my graduate school education at Cornell. And just to say a little bit about sort of, I was thinking and reflecting, so I've given you all the overview and sort of how I ended up as a developmental psychologist working for the research arm of the US Department of Education. So 2 things. One, my mom, I grew up in a household where education was very much valued. One of my mother's primary reasons for relocating her family to the US was she wanted to provide better educational opportunities for myself and my siblings, opportunities that were not available to her. So that was always something that was of high value. And then in my own educational experience, I saw firsthand the value and the importance of having access to high quality educational opportunities. And I also saw the consequences of having access to less than optimal educational opportunities. In my experience in elementary and middle school in New York City, I really observed and experienced inequality in many ways, just in terms of the expectations of us as students, access to resources and other things that we had or did not have. And I was always a very curious child. My mother says this even before I have any formal memories. And so I started actually asking questions about, okay, well, why are we using books in the 1960s? Why do our teachers tell us they don't care if we learn anything? And it was in middle school that I really actually started thinking about psychology. I didn't have any models at home, no one to ask about, hey, is this even a profession, an idea, like where does this come from? But I started asking questions, really thinking about risk and resilience based on looking at just the development and the experiences of people in my community, as well as my own experience. And so I sought out information, and early on, I started to learn about psychology, and it was like, oh, this is a thing. I never knew this was a track or an option in terms of a career choice. As I said, no prior exposure. But so I left middle school with like, okay, this is an idea. This is something I can pursue. And then in high school, I had the opportunity to take a psychology class and do my first study. And I was really hooked on just the idea of doing research and talking to people and summarizing ideas and making interpretations. It really appealed to me. And so I knew when I went to college that I wanted to major in psychology, but I didn't limit myself to that. So I was a psychology major, but I also took a lot of African history classes because that was important to me. I took classes in education as well, because again, sort of this intersection of things. When I was at Wellesley, I had the opportunity to, again, engage in some research experiences and really think to myself, okay, this is a thing, what will I do with a bachelor's? And I thought a lot about that because there aren't that many options in terms of, okay, you have a bachelor's in psychology, or there weren't, I should say. When I finished college in the 90s, it was like, okay, what am I going to do with this? So I knew I wanted to go on to graduate school, and I had some great mentorship from my professors at Wellesley who gave me some good advice, because I was really very much interested in not doing more experimental or lab-based. I was more interested in applied sort of psychology approaches to things. And so one of my advisors said, well, why don't you think about human development programs? And so I kept that in mind and started thinking and really thought, you know what, I should go and get some work experience and figure out if I truly want to follow this track and go to graduate school. And so I did that for a couple of years before graduate school. And that was really helpful to kind of form and shape my ideas and really convince me that, okay, this is something you want to invest years out of your life, time, energy, effort, and resources in doing. So this is sort of the big story of from the early years to where I ended up in terms of my graduate training, but very much motivated by, I think, my early experiences as a student, and then opportunities that I had available to me, like the Fieldston Enrichment Program, the ABC program, being able to go away to a boarding school, and these opportunities that really set me up for higher education, but also being aware that everyone doesn't have access to that, and really developing a value of sort of everyone should have that, whether or not you're in your local neighborhood school or you're away at a boarding school, you should have access to high quality learning opportunities across the entire developmental continuum. Can you tell I feel strongly about that? I feel strongly about that. So we will revisit that. So that's my background in terms of my educational experience. I think it's also important to just give you an overview of my research and work experience. And so my undergraduate research. So when I was in college, I did some independent research. I focused on racial stereotyping and preschool age children. And I knew sort of early on, I took all of the required courses that I needed to take as a psychology major, but I determined early on that I really was interested in developmental psychology and in the early years within developmental psychology, which can span, the entire lifespan. But I really was interested in the early years of development. And so doing that project and having the opportunity to do, again, some independent research just really helped to kind of build my love for the field and my love of this path in terms of a research track for the work. And then I also was fortunate as an undergrad to work with a professor on a study and to co-author a book chapter that was published out of that work. So those were my sort of undergraduate research experiences that really set me up well for the work that I did after college, and then the work that I did in graduate school. So after college, I worked for 2 years at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. This was where I was like, okay, I know I want to be in this field. How far do I want to go? Do I need a master's? Do I need a Ph.D.? I remember when I applied for my job, my boss who I worked for said, oh, after 2 years, you'll know. And because you'll see that you can only go so far with a bachelor's in psychology. And so I had the opportunity when I was at the New York State Psychiatric Institute to work on 2 projects that really helped to strengthen my research skills. So, in college, I took a lot of coursework, had some research experience, but I got to work on 2 large initiatives. One was part of the Human Genome Project. And so I worked on a genetic linkage study of panic disorder. And what did that entail? Well, I spent a lot of time recruiting families, calling families across the country. And again, these are families with anxiety disorders, trying to convince them to participate in a study where we would send someone to their home to draw blood from the family members. They were highly motivated because the whole point was really trying to understand the genetic roots of their disorder and to potentially help other family members and other people. So that was really helpful to me in really getting to engage with study participants and focus on things like, how do you recruit people? How do you screen them? How do you document all of that work? So those were really good real life opportunities in terms of research. The other project I worked on was the a study of depressed children grown up. And that was a longitudinal study, a 10-year longitudinal study. And so I spent a lot of time trying to track folks down before the internet was as wonderful as it is today. So it was interesting. I did a lot of things that, again, really helped me to learn some important aspects of what it means to do research in a real world setting and trying to find people who were in early adulthood by the time the follow-up study was being conducted. And so those experiences, wonderful teaching and learning opportunities for me. And at that point, I was ready for and applied for and went to graduate school. And so while I was at Cornell, for my master's work, I focused on looking at children's social function and how it was related to maternal emotional expressiveness. So I did work really, again, tailoring and focusing my work on preschoolers. I worked with children and families, children who were enrolled in Head Start programs in upstate New York, because it really became clear to me that not only was I passionate about developmental psychology, not only did I care about early childhood, but within that, I care most about the needs of those who are most underserved in terms of our society and programs and things like that. So I wanted to center my research around that, around quote unquote at-risk families. And so I did both my master's and dissertation work. I really wanted to go out and do field work. So I didn't want to just use someone's data set, use the work that my advisor was working on. It was really important for me to go out and collect data. So for my dissertation, I collected data looking at children's early school adjustment, which meant driving around upstate New York to different preschool programs. But it was great experience for me because I had to write letters to get access to the programs, to recruit the families, to go out and do all of the consenting, to go out and go to classrooms, to the preschool classrooms and assess the children and have teachers do teacher reports. And I'm itemizing these things because when I finished graduate school and started my work at IES, all of these experiences were critical to my work. So I not only had the training in terms of my formal classroom training in terms of research methods, statistics, theoretical models, all of those things. I also had real world experience applying and thinking about, okay, how do you conduct and manage a study from start to finish? And pretty much I spend my days now talking to people about that all the time and have for almost 2 decades. And so those experiences were really critical in terms of shaping my work and providing me with the training and the skills and the knowledge that I've then been able to apply over time in my current work. So when I finished grad school and left Cornell, I knew before I left graduate school, I should say, I knew that I wanted to follow a non-academic track. I considered academic positions, but I really wanted to be in a place where we're really shaping the course of the research and not just conducting work in sort of a small space. Not that there's anything against that if you choose to go into follow an academic track and do very focused research, but I really always wanted to link things to policy. And in fact, when I went off to grad school, one of my dreams is like, oh, I'll go work for the Children's Defense Fund. Well, that didn't exactly work out, but I've been able to do a lot of work with very important policy and practice implications. But so I knew when I was going through grad school that I wanted non-academic options. I considered jobs at research organizations. There are a lot of great research organizations that employ psychologists who have the training to do that work, who employ developmental psychologists. And I also considered the National Institute of Health because I was more familiar with their work. I did not really think about or consider the U.S. Department of Education as a home for developmental psychologists, but it turned out it was a great fit with the Institute of Education Sciences, which I applied for the job in August, and in the process of applying and starting, your federal government passed legislation to actually create the institute that I work for. So I started there in October of 2002. The legislation was passed October of 2002. And so that's kind of set up where I am now. So I'll say a little bit about that quickly, just to give you guys some background about the Institute of Education Sciences. If like me, you were unfamiliar or are unfamiliar with their work. So this is, so I've given you an overview of my background, my educational experience, my graduate training, and some of my thoughts and decision points along the way. And so just a few slides about where I work. So the Institute of Education Sciences is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. We are charged with providing rigorous and relevant evidence to inform education policy and practice, and to disseminate that information widely to a wide range of stakeholders. And we have lots of different stakeholders. We have Congress, we have school districts, we have school leaders, we have teachers, we have students and families. So a wide range of stakeholders, policymakers who are interested in the work, other funders who are interested in the work we produce. So the information gets disseminated out in many different ways to try to reach those different audiences. So I work there are 4 centers within the Institute. There are 2 research centers, and I work in one of the 2 research centers. And the overarching goal of those research centers are to really try to identify education interventions, whether it's at the sort of classroom level of teaching and learning, or it's programs and policies and different approaches to really improve education for students across the continuum from birth through kindergarten through 12th grade to post-secondary and adult education, to identify what works. And we also sadly do a lot of identifying what does not work, because it turns out there are a lot of things that people think work but do not in terms of things to support education. And then to try to understand the underlying processes, and to also develop measures and other tools to support learning and development for students. So as I said, I work in the National Center for Education Research, and we are tasked with conducting research to increase student academic achievement, to identify and reduce opportunity and achievement gaps, and to increase access to and completion of post-secondary education. And we do this, as I said, across the entire developmental continuum. So from early childhood to post-secondary, and we also support predoctoral and postdoctoral training programs to really try to invest in not just studying students at each stage of their development, or studying teachers or studying adult learners, but also to train researchers to do work in the education science field. So what does a typical day for me look like? So we've gotten to that, I'm just doing a time check here. So, okay, so I have kind of 2 key roles. One is I'm the team lead for early childhood research. And in that capacity, I spend a lot of my time engaging with different stakeholders, different people within the Department of Education. So I work collaboratively with colleagues in other program offices in the Department of Education. I work with colleagues in the Institute where I work in the other 3 centers to really focus on and contribute to different early childhood initiatives. So in my immediate work, it's my responsibility to represent the Institute to internal and external entities in terms of the early childhood investments that we've made, not just the projects that I monitor, but the investments that we've made across the entire Institute. I engage with different stakeholders at the department. I work with colleagues at the Department of Health and Human Services. For example, they manage programs like the Head Start program, childcare. So wherever there are folks who are doing work in the early childhood space at the federal level, I engage with them on a regular basis. We share information about the work that we're doing. We make sure that the work that we're doing is helpful to informing policymakers. There have been concrete opportunities to be able to say, okay, the federal government is ready to make a significant investment, say, for example, in a new early childhood programming, to expand a program or to launch a new program. where is the research? What's the evidence base? What can we cite or support to provide a justification for the investments that will be made? So I engage with different stakeholders related to those things. I also engage sometimes with external funders. So there are other funders who support early childhood work. There's several foundations who do work in the early childhood space, to engage in with them. So in many different ways, my job is to really use my expertise as a developmental psychologist, my years of experience and expertise in the early childhood research space, to really inform the development of new initiatives, as well as to provide input into existing initiatives to strengthen the quality of both the research that's done, but also in thinking about how that research is being used to inform policy and practice. And then my other day job is I'm a program officer. So what does that mean? So it means I manage a portfolio of research grants. And in my role as program officer, I have sort of two primary sort of subcategories of things that I do. A lot of my work revolves around grant making. That's the grant competitions piece of things where I work with researchers who are seeking federal grant funding. And when I say I work with them, from start to finish, so someone can email me and say, I have an idea for a project. Is this a good idea? Is it a good fit with your funding announcement? Am I moving in the right direction? So I work with folks from the very sort of initial idea stage, as far as reading full drafts of their proposals, where I'll give them feedback on both the theoretical background, the methods, their whole approach, even how they put together a research team and the personnel to do the work. So we provide a lot of substantive, meaningful technical assistance to applicants on the grant competition side. On the grant management side, I monitor funded research projects, and I monitor them from beginning to end. So from the time the grants get awarded to the time that they close out. And when the grants get awarded, I read the grant applications, I ask questions about the methods, about the approach. I work with the grantees to strengthen the work that they're doing, and I work with them on an ongoing basis to make sure that the work is done well. I would say I capture everything I've talked about in that a key aspect of what I do is centers around relationship building. The center of it is relationships, initiating and establishing new relationships with different people that I work with, cultivating those relationships and maintaining them over time. There are some researchers who I've worked with for going on almost 20 years, and there are others who are new researchers, meaning it's their first time. I actually get really excited about first-time applicants because I think it's always important to think about how we're expanding the pool of sort of who we're funding and supporting, and making sure that we're diversifying that space, because frankly, it is not a very diverse space in terms of who does the work. A lot of the work focuses on Black and Brown children. A lot of the work focuses on children from low-income families, but that is not necessarily reflected in who is doing the work. So as part of my job, I work with folks to make sure that what they do is done well and that it's done in a thoughtful and meaningful way. And a lot of it is around those relationships that I build over time. Now, the developmental psychologist in me enters into that in many ways because I'm talking to people all the time about their study design, how they're assessing young children, are the measures appropriate, how they're approaching their work, how they're engaging with families, all the different aspects of what they're doing. How are they presenting and sharing out the information at the end of the day? Are they engaging with the folks who participated in the project and including them in that as partners and working with them in a thoughtful way? So all of those things are involved in my work on a daily basis. So on a given day, I spend time talking to researchers across the country. A lot of that's done by phone because I work with mostly university researchers and also with research scientists at some research firms, and they're based across the country. And so, being flexible in terms of speaking to people in California or in New York or in Florida or wherever they are, but working on an ongoing basis with them to ensure that the work that they're doing is really making a contribution in a positive way to our knowledge base and also to families and communities. And so this just gives you, and I'm looking at time, this gives you just an example of some of the early childhood initiatives that I work on. So The most recent one, so part of my job also involves sort of proposing new research grant programs and initiatives, and the Early Learning Research Network is my Bronfenbrenner study. I had the pleasure of actually spending a little bit of time with Yuri Bronfenbrenner when I was at Cornell, and he's just made a lasting impact on me, he's made a lasting impact on the entire field. And so this study, it was really, it's a whole research initiative. It's a $26 million initiative where we funded different research teams to do work looking at different factors at different levels. So looking at policies and systems that have implications for children's learning and development. Then we have classroom level studies, really looking at classroom level processes and practices that are related to children's development. And then a third study, and that is a longitudinal study. So following a cohort of children over time from the transition from preschool into the early elementary grades. And that really, the framing and my thinking about that initiative when we launched that, again, really based out of my training and background as a developmental psychologist, and really bringing that into the space of how do we do good early childhood education research with this framework. And so that's I currently monitor that network and those projects. And then I also monitor a whole host of projects under the early learning programs and policies research topic. And under that, we fund development of new measures. So we've invested in, for example, a lot of measures to assess outcomes for young dual language learners. We've invested in the development of new interventions. We invest in the evaluation of interventions. We invest in the evaluation of pre-K programs and programming and new policies and initiatives. And then previous projects that I funded that are no longer active, we have these national research and development centers. So we funded one focused on early childhood education that was really focused on the workforce and on teacher professional development interventions for early childhood educators. And then the reason I came to IES in the first place was to work on a preschool curriculum evaluation research project where I managed evaluation contracts and then managed a portfolio of grants, all evaluating preschool curricula that were in use at the time. So that just gives you a little bit of that background. So at another transition point, so that gives you the whole story. I have a couple additional slides and then I'll be happy to take questions. So the first is thinking about the road ahead. So I've been engaged in the work that I just described for 19 years now. And I have a slide here with pictures and why, because to me, the most important thing to keep in mind are the children and the families and the communities who hopefully benefit from the work that we're doing. We're using taxpayer dollars to fund research, and it's never been my idea that research should just be done for the sake of research. I very much feel and believe that it should be done to benefit families and children and communities, especially in the early childhood space, in every space, I think across the whole developmental continuum. So I have this here just to keep myself, to remind myself of sort of, as I look ahead to sort of where are we going as a field and what needs to get done, to never lose sight of the families. When I started at IES, I used to keep a board up in my office with drawings from the preschool programs that I used to drive around to when I was in graduate school, and the kids would draw pictures for me. And I also, did some work at our Child Development Center there at Cornell. And I wanted those pictures and those notes from those kids to be front and center in my mind, to remember that we're not just talking about data points. We're not just talking about you get a publication as a researcher when you go out and study families and you study children. We're not just talking about the statistics and the tables, but there are human lives behind all of that. And that development is ongoing even while we're doing our work and our research. So to always keep that in mind. And so that's how I started my thinking in this field. And I try to remind myself always that this is what's important. These pictures, examples of children engaged in different activities, children engaged with parents, that's where it's at. And the work that I support through my role as a program officer and as a team lead, I hope all the time that it does a better job of informing and helping families and communities. So that's what I keep front and center. And with that in mind, I thought it would be helpful to just share a few things, sort of what I'm thinking about and where I see the field headed in the future. The pandemic has upended life for everyone. It's been really, really particularly difficult in the early childhood space. It's the impact on the workforce. I'm sure you've all seen the articles or heard about it, seen different stories, or maybe it's impacted you personally. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done and a lot of room for improvement in the field. The early childhood portfolio at the institute where I work is one of our largest investments over time. And yet I see that there are clear holes in how we do our work and what needs to be done. So we really need to work on making sure that we center equity in the work moving forward. That has not always been the case. We need to make sure that we're using, rigorous methods and approaches to the work. And we need to build a stronger and higher quality early learning system and really use the research to inform improvements in that system and to guide new investments in that system. Right now, there's legislation in consideration of how to expand universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds. I personally have some thoughts about that. I think that there are ways where research is absolutely informing that work, and that's how it should be. And there's plenty of room for improvement in terms of how we do that work moving forward. And then I think what has emerged over time, and this is in the early childhood space, but it's probably applicable to other stages of development and work with K-12 or even post-secondary students, always a need for better measures, and especially as there are new investments in early childhood, and one of the priorities is always, how can we have higher quality program? It's a sad situation right now that families and communities who need the highest quality programming usually get the lowest quality programming. So as we think about how we increase the quality of programming, we do need better measures and tools to help kind of guide us and gauge how we're doing in terms of improving that. And then, as I mentioned, the pandemic has impacted everyone in many different ways, and the early childhood workforce, so much needs to be done there in terms of compensation and training and support for members of that workforce moving forward. So even after 19 years, this is just a few examples of all the work that I think still needs to be done. And hopefully we will invest in some of that. We mean in the institute where I work for, but that other funders and other agencies will invest in the work as well. And I wanted to end with this. So I've shared my journey from the early years to where I am now. And I thought it would be helpful to just end with some questions for you guys. I know you have questions for me, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of recap and remember wherever you are in your journey. If you're an undergrad and you're thinking, do I want to go to grad school? You're in the master's program. And it's like, do I want to stop here or do something else? That things that really guided me, and I think everyone needs to think about, is what's your destination? So where do you want to end up? What's motivating you? You really need to be highly motivated. Grad school is not easy. Work is not easy. There are a lot of things that are challenging in life. So you want to make sure that you have something that's really going to sustain you when you're in those like low points or challenging situations. What questions or issues do you care about? How does your lived experience inform what you want to do and how you will approach your work? Because we all carry who we are to the work that we do. And how can you apply a developmental science lens to a specific topic or issue? And what training do you think you'll need to accomplish your goals? And then how can you use your training to really answer questions that will improve development for children and adults? So I will, the next slide is a discussion in Q&A, but can I go back to that one? Or we can stop here and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ebanks, for sharing your journey with us. If anyone has questions, please post them in the chat. You can also raise your hand. If I don't see your hand right away, I will see it, so keep your hand raised. We did get some questions ahead of time, and we also already have some questions in the chat. I'm going to paraphrase some of your questions, not read them directly, just in the interest of time. And I'm also going to apologize for any noise behind me. I'm in New York City and we're in the middle of a major storm, so there's a lot of rain. So I hope that's not interfering too much with the sound. Montserrat had a question about how you remain positive given all of the inequality that you observe, and in particular when you see the unevenness in resources that families have.
Great question. I think about the children in my own life, sort of, and the children of family and friends. So that helps to keep me motivated, Montserrat. And I also, in terms of my work, I think about examples of where the research has really helped to improve some policy or some initiative or some program that was going to get rolled out that involves a significant investment of funds. And I look at sort of incremental improvements over 20 years. I have seen progress. And so that gives me hope, both progress in the work that has been done, the broader field of research in early childhood, not just the work that I've monitored or managed, the research projects. And also I see that there's some diversification in the field in terms of who is doing the work, which I think is important. And so that gives me some hope as well for the future of the science, for the future of the research, that we are having a more diverse group of folks asking and answering questions that I think will get us better information to address some of the inequalities. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. So we have some questions that came in ahead of time, and there were quite a few about training and how it is that you know what credentials you need. So how do you know what credentials you need, what opportunities are available? You mentioned in your own experience that someone said to you, after 2 years of work, you'll know whether you need to get something more than a bachelor's. So a lot of our students are currently in a master's program. Can you tell them a little bit about what should inform their decision-making in terms of career paths and what opportunities are available depending on the credentials they have?
Right. So I do think, I know that there are opportunities at the master's level to go out and do work at that level, and you don't need to go on and get your PhD. But part of that is really depends on what you hope to do next. So everyone in my office has a PhD. Not everyone is a developmental psychologist. A subset of us are, but everyone has a PhD, because that's the level of training that they wanted in terms of folks who are monitoring research, because a lot of our work is working with other PhD level researchers. But I also know over time that there are plenty of projects that include master's level members of the team in roles where they're managing the project. They're doing a lot of the research, the in-field research work. So there's certainly opportunities at those levels. At either level, whether you're at the master's or PhD, I think the core coursework and training that you get is important. I know that was important for me. And then I've also had a lot of on-the-job training, as well as we've done a lot of sort of in-service training of our team over time, because people have come from different backgrounds, even with their PhD, in terms of different disciplinary backgrounds. So I would say there are options out there if at the end of your master's, you're like, okay, I don't want to go to grad school, I want to go out and work. Or if you're already working in a space, continue working in that space, but you have more credentials to negotiate, other opportunities. There are plenty of opportunities if you have invested in making sure that you have some basic training in terms of theory, in terms of research methods, study design, some important statistical training is important. So all of those things that I think you would get from a set of core courses, and maybe opportunities to work where you're able to apply that, or to have some coursework where you're able to apply some of the knowledge that you gain in the classroom instruction or in those courses, will be helpful to you at the master's or the PhD level. Because a lot of this is, when you're out, there are different aspects of conducting a research project where the skill sets you get in terms of the core coursework and training can be applied at both the master's level. And if you get additional training at the PhD level, there are more opportunities for things that you can do. But either level, I think really thinking about the core set of coursework, and then opportunities to apply that if you're able to work on a research project or work with someone to really test out, some of your knowledge in real world settings.
Okay, so we have a few questions about what you can do with a bachelor's in psychology, and also about how to go about getting more research experience when you're working on your bachelor's. So I'm going to ask you to first start with, how do you get experience while working with a bachelor's? And second, what can you do when you have a bachelor's in psych?
So what can you do? So when I was in undergrad, I took coursework where part of the requirement was that I had to do an independent research project and go through the whole process of proposing it and having it reviewed as part of the coursework. So if there are opportunities like that, I think that would be a good experience because you're doing that with a lot of support, say from your professor or a mentor or someone else. And then if there are opportunities for you to work with a professor, to work, if somebody has a lab where you can do some work in their lab, those are also good opportunities to, a lot of undergrads do that. I know I supervised undergrads at Cornell who were doing that, who wanted some of that experience. And so if there are those opportunities to seek out opportunities like that, if there's coursework where part of that involves doing an actual research project, great. But if not, then I would try to seek out whether or not you can work on somebody's project, if they have a funded project, if they can include you in that in some way so that you're able to get some of that experience. And then the other part of the question was, what can you do with a bachelor's? So with my bachelor's in psychology, I worked where I started out as a research assistant, where I was working on that genetic linkage study. That was at the bachelor's level, where I was recruiting and screening participants for a study, doing data entry work. I then, was associate project coordinator. Well, that meant I organized a course that we taught at the institute where I worked at the time. I also, did some data, some tracking, other things. And in fact, that resulted in a publication. And so that's the other thing. If you're thinking longer term about you want to go an academic track, is to kind of think about when you're at these different stages, whether it's undergrad, where I was able to work with a professor and have a publication from that, or my job between undergrad and grad school, where also there was a publication that resulted from that, is really ways you can get engaged. And I was able to do a lot of things that require basic just research methods, knowledge, and skills that I learned as in my bachelor's program, and to apply that there. So in terms of the methods piece around recruiting samples, tracking participants for the longitudinal study, coding data, and doing things like that, you can do that with your bachelor's degree. And there are opportunities to do that both at the place where I worked at, like a research organization, and also, there are other places where you would be able to have that, have those work experiences with your bachelor's degree.
Yes, as Dr. Ebanks said, very often the people who are managing the day-to-day of research aren't necessarily the PhDs. They're people with bachelor's degrees and master's degrees. So you'll find that the research assistants, research coordinators, the people who are managing the budget for the grant or something like that, often these are people with bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, as opposed to someone with the person with the PhD, the principal investigator. We have a couple of other questions, a few more questions. One question is, how can we as students work on or help in translating research into education/early childhood policy? And that's from Raven Nikita Collins.
Right, so I think if you're reading the research, you can always do that with a critical eye and think about applications to real world experiences that you're aware of, Raven, Nikita, and then kind of, so I think there are ways as a student to approach the research and think about, okay, how you can distill that into, education policy and practice. So it helps if you kind of have an end in point. So if you're reading, for example, about the effectiveness of preschool curricula, then you can think about, okay, is there any way I can distill this information into something that's useful for parents or for early childhood educators? So how do we translate that, those findings that, if you have an evidence-based curriculum with a scope and sequence that's valuable to students? Well, there are different people who need that information. So, okay, how can you communicate that to an early childhood educator, for example? They don't need the peer-reviewed journal article version. And so it involves kind of thinking about that, doing that translation in terms of communicating. So pick an audience is, I guess, one way to think about it. Pick an audience you want to translate that work for, and then think about that. So in this example with the curriculum, do you want to translate it for parents? Do you want to say, hey, how can I distill down this article into, I don't know, 2 or 3 bullet points, a 1-pager, even just, a message or a headline to parents of like, hey, this is something you should pay attention to. Or if it's an early childhood educator, like, you should do these 2 or 3 things to really help students. We do have a center at the Institute where they take all of the research and they do reviews of the research, and then they develop practice guides for practitioners. And so some of that involves, and now it's much more, it's sort of a multimedia approach, right? So they'll have brief documents or policy briefs or reports is another way to translate that empirical research in the journal article version into something useful. It could be having video clips and actually demonstrating and illustrating to folks sort of what they can do and how they can do something based on the research. So I hope that's helpful. It's not an exhaustive list, but I hope that's helpful.
Well, Ralph Bernardo has a question about your program evaluation work, right. And in particular about when things work, when things don't work, and whether you could share it. Could you share an example with us of lessons you've learned from doing these projects evaluations?
So I can share an example from that preschool curriculum evaluation research project we funded, where we evaluated many curricula that were in wide use in early childhood programs at the time. And we learned most of them were not effective. And so we communicated that information out in many different ways. And something that's surprising to me, Ralph, is that a lot of times it's difficult to get folks to change what they're doing, even when they're presented with evidence. So that's a case where a lot of what was being used was not effective, but some programs continued to use it, others made changes immediately. And in other cases, it took additional research to kind of illustrate to them like, hey, you know, there are other approaches, there are other things you should do instead of this over time. So that's an example where things didn't work. We disseminated out the information, but the change from the point at which that was disseminated to the change actually took several years and is still ongoing in a case like that. And then there are other cases where something was successful. So for example, we funded an evaluation of the Boston preschool program. The evidence from that was great as sort of if you have teachers who you pay well, and if you provide early childhood educators with a lot of training, if you pay them the same as you pay your K-12 teachers, and if you provide, you know, rigorous and evidence-based curricula, there are benefits for children. The evidence from that study was part of the evidence that was used to then support investments in federal level early childhood initiatives, as well as New York City's own universal pre-K program. So they used some of the evidence from that Boston program. So there are examples on both sides of something didn't work, but also when something does work, it's kind of, it's fulfilling to see how it then fits into future policy or practice decisions.
So we have a question from Bathsheba Friedman about follow-up studies. So when a new policy is in place, whose responsibility is it to make sure that there's ongoing evaluation of the policy?
Great question. So for federal level initiatives, so for example, during the Obama administration, there was a preschool development grant program. There was an early learning challenge grant program. So these were major sort of policy changes and sort of rolling out new early childhood initiatives. And part of what happens with those federal programs is that there's some money set aside for evaluation. And there is a National Center for Education Evaluation at the Institute where I work. It's their responsibility to do that work, to do an evaluation to say, okay, was this program rollout effective? So that's at a sort of a large policy rollout level. At the level of an individual study, so say someone conducts a study and they have some findings, we do support replication. So for example, if you did a study in one context with one population, we support and encourage the idea that, okay, you should do replications. You should try to see if this works in different locations with different populations, with different approaches to the work. And so in some cases, federal programs will have funds set aside to support the evaluation. And in other cases, the researchers will do additional research. Sometimes I see a second part of your question here is it the responsibility of the stakeholders? It's a responsibility of the researchers to disseminate out to the stakeholders. And in some cases, the researchers partner with the stakeholders. They'll partner with the state or local education agencies. They'll partner with the preschool programs to do additional or ongoing work if once a program is being rolled out or as a follow-up to a program rollout or as a follow-up to a previous study. So I didn't talk about that, but there are great examples of good researcher practitioner partnership, meaning researchers working very closely with practitioners, meaning, and in our case, it's whether it's at the preschool level or K-12 level, working with those state and local education agencies and education leaders to do additional research on a program or practice or policy.
Okay, so I'm going to combine, Joe, I'm going to combine your question with a few questions that we received ahead, and this has to do with PhD training. So we had a couple of questions that came in ahead of your talk about whether you can provide some advice to those who are interested in PhD programs. And Joe Weller's question is about how you find a mentor to help you through PhD process.
Great question, Joe. I say do your research. When I was applying, I always had a research mindset, because when I was applying to grad school, I really looked at programs. I looked at a range of programs and got accepted to several. And part of my decision-making process was really looking at the depth and the breadth of researchers there. So sometimes you apply to a program and you're applying to work with one person in their lab. And then what happens if they leave? Things change for you. And so part of my process when I was doing my research, yes, they were considering my application, but I was considering them by really looking at, are there several people at that in that program who are doing work that I'm interested in? So not just, one person who's a rock star, because they may or may not have time for me. So for example, I went to Cornell thinking I would work with a more senior person, and I ended up having a early career or new faculty person, which worked out very well. And so I had more senior people on my committee as mentors, but my committee chair was someone who had more time and flexibility to work with me. There were 2 programs where I decided, part of my decision not to go to those programs was because between the time that I applied and got accepted, there were huge faculty turnover, and there was a history of either faculty leaving or you go to work with the big name people and they're unavailable. So I would say, try to do some research ahead of time. If you have opportunities to visit before you make the decisions, talk to other students, pay attention, and most importantly, think about, is there a program where there are a range of folks you can work with, and thinking about who would be your committee chair versus other committee members, that you have several options just in case, so you don't set yourself up where you're just going to work with one person. And if that doesn't work out, you end up in a challenging situation potentially. So that, I think, was one of the most useful things for me. And then once I got there, I took classes with different people. So I was assigned to somebody as sort of like my primary person who did work that I was interested in the area that I wanted to work in. But then I had other committee members who didn't do work in that area, but they brought other strengths and expertise to my panel, to my committee. And so one of the things to think about is when you're there, so you might have a primary mentor, but how you find other mentors. You take classes with people, you see sort of, because it's relationship, you're going to be working with these folks over time, and they're supposed to be mentors and in some cases advocates for you. So you also want to see sort of who are you getting along with, and are they doing work that's important? Do you think they can add, what component will they add to the area of research or interest that you have? So those are just a few things to think about.
Okay, we're going to do 2 last questions. We are at time, but we have several more questions that I haven't gotten to, so I'm going to try to condense these into 2 final questions. Joe, anyone else who's interested in knowing more about how to pick a mentor, I have a chapter on that. Send me an email, isabel.alicia@cuny.edu. My chapter just came out in the book Thriving in Grad School, and I can get a copy to you. But that was fantastic advice, Dr. Ebanks. Dr. Ebanks didn't mention this, but she worked in the lab of a professor who was not her advisor, and she actually ran that lab basically. She basically ran the lab. And that's another conversation for another time. So we have another question from Nikita Collins, which is, do people receive specific training in policy as part of their PhD education? And how do you make sure you get that experience as a grad student?
Great question. I think about the graduate program you're going to. So At Cornell, I was actually in the human development program, not the traditional psychology, not the psychology department. And that is because the psychology department focused more on kind of lab-based approaches to work, and the human development program had it had a subcategory that focused on developmental psychology from really more of an applied lifespan development perspective. So I think you want to pay attention to where you're going to and the type of program it is. Is it more of an applied type of program or something where you're going to do lab-based work? And so that's sort of how do you gain experience and do that work and the training. So quickly, policy experience. I took some coursework there in the policy analysis management department at Cornell. And I took several classes in education as an undergrad as well. So those things kind of, and so there are opportunities to do that depending on the program. And this is again, where you want to think about the program you're applying to and the larger, other resources or opportunities at the university. If you decide, oh, I really want to be on the developmental track, but I want more of a policy focus or an education focus. So within the human development department, there were folks who do policy work. And I also, as I said, took some coursework in the policy analysis management piece. So that kind of really rounded out the policy piece. But beginning in undergrad, I started to build a background and really trying to understand education that way as well. But you can do that at the graduate level. I think the key thing is think again about the program you're choosing and is there a range of options available to you to have coursework or to work with or mentorship with folks who do more policy work or do more education work if that's not the primary focus for your program that you apply to.
So I see a few more questions that are career focused, but we need to wrap up because we are over time. But so anyone who has a career focused question that wasn't answered today, please, I welcome your emails, please contact me. But I wanted to take advantage of Dr. Ebanks being here and being that she works for our federal government. I wanted to ask her about transitions between administrations. So this is my final question. What is it like dealing with the transition from one administration to another? And how does that impact your research and research priorities and research choices? And what are they doing with our tax dollars? I guess is the other thing.
Great questions. Your tax dollars at work, sometimes they're working for you and sometimes not so much. Great questions. So I have worked now across several administrations. So I started during Bush 1, George W. Bush 1, and then Bush 2, and then 2 rounds of the Obama administration, and then the previous administration to the current administration. And so with the exception of the previous administration before the Biden administration, all of those Bush, Obama, and Biden all have an interest in and focus on early childhood education. And that has played itself out in that depending on the administration and their priorities, a lot of them seem to have priorities focused on early childhood and post-secondary education, and also generally on K-12. And so that will inform some of the initiatives that we have and develop, right? So if an administration is in place that really cares about young children and families, you're going to see more policy initiatives, more legislation rolling out related to that. And then relatedly, we'll want to engage in research to address those policies or practices. I have to say, up until the previous administration, the focus on early childhood across both Republican and Democratic administrations, so Bush and Obama, strong focus on early childhood education, which played itself out in different ways. The Trump administration, not so much. The current administration definitely seems to have some priorities and focus on that. And so that's specific to the work that I do. I think in general, it's challenging depending on the degree to which the administration values education and values research. And so my first, I guess that's 16 years, there was always a strong focus on education, and there is now, and for about 4 years or so, science, not very respected. I'm trying to be as diplomatic as I can, and not always, definitely not a very much a strong focus on research and early childhood research. So things play out differently because each administration has topic areas and priorities that they focus on. And that shifts, depending on who is in office and what their interests are. And so that folds itself into our work, because we often end up starting new initiatives related to the interests of the current administration. And we also maintain some of our ongoing work that's relevant and is not related to, say, a given administration. So sometimes the tax dollars, I would say, in terms of research, I think the intention is always good to use those funds well. I will say there are certainly many examples of, we fund work with the best of expectations and hopes, and sometimes it's somewhat disappointing. Our institute, because it's nonpartisan, it doesn't tend to get caught up in the politicization of things, in terms of we're able to put out findings even if it disagrees with an initiative that an administration wanted us to do research on. If the findings come back negative, we are able to release that because it's not, it's not a partisan institute. So that is part of our legislation, that we should be able to be independent and put out the evidence, whether it supports or contradicts the policies or intent of the administration.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ebanks. It's really been a pleasure having you with us here at SPS. We hope at some point in the future that you will join us again, maybe as part of a more research-focused conversation. And I want to thank everyone who's attended tonight. Please, send follow-up questions as you have them. We have another day in the life coming up for IO that's specific to industrial organizational psychology on November 9th. And again, thank you, Dr. Ebanks. And we are so lucky to have been able to share in your journey and hear some words of wisdom and for those who are considering careers in psychology. So good night, everyone.
I was just going to say quickly, sorry, I put my email in the chat. I know people had lots of questions. Please feel free to reach out to me, whether about your career track or about just the grant or anything else that I've shared. Happy to talk to you individually and to just follow up if people have burning questions. Feel free to contact me.
Oh, thank you so much. So save that email address. Save that email address. All right. Well, thank you to everyone. Have a good night, everyone. And I will see you at the Lunch and Learn that's coming up, where we're going to talk about how to write about research. Good night, everyone.